Joining us now on Practical 365 is Shinesa Cambric. Hi, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. So before we get started, for those that don't know you, do you want to give us a little bit of an introduction? Because when I looked at your bio, you've got quite the expertise. It certainly brought me to shame, that's for sure.
Oh, well, thank you. And I won't go into all the details of all the past bodies that have been buried, but essentially I've been in IT for 20 plus years. I started off as an application developer and then had the privilege of moving over to application security as a result of Enron and SOX and the need to, have people understand that world. Gradually from there, moving into compliance, moving into identity and access management, security architecture, and then now I find myself in the privileged role of being able to protect Microsoft from fraud and abuse. So my team looks after features that help to develop ways to detect synthetic account creation against Microsoft and against our partners. We also look for applications that have been created for malicious purposes that may have been set up by bad actors, and then also unrelated fraud and abuse.
So when we're thinking of, sometimes I think in the past I've heard about OneDrive accounts being used, or a tenant being set up that's being used to send out spams, not an uncommon occurrence to have happened, that sort of thing.
That's exactly what my team takes care of. And so partnering with our other services like Skype, like Xbox, like OneDrive, to identify these bad actors that may have gained access to a resource, ways through machine learning and algorithms to detect them and then kick them out of our environment to, again, protect Microsoft and protect our customers. Ideally, we're very preventative and we don't allow them to get in the first place. We know security requires layers, and so there's prevention, detection, and mitigation.
So this is, I guess, these days more complex than one of those selectors to prove that you're not actually a robot.
Yeah.
Because I did hear when, I think it was the GPT-4 model was being trained, that when they were doing some of the safety controls, it had basically some sort of an agent that was tasked with going and doing things, and one of those was, correct me if I'm wrong, and you know this better than me, they recruited somebody on something like Fiverr to help them as a vision impaired person to fill in the "I'm not a robot," which stuck in my mind as one of the most silly things that could happen. But it just makes it a bit of an arms race, isn't it? With uncensored models that people can run outside of the Microsoft cloud, that they can train to do whatever they want.
Yeah, and bad actors get very creative. So there's a set of bad actors who they're willing to go through any level of friction to get access to a high value resource. Sets of bad actors who set up what we call fraud farms, for example, and so they're continuously testing processes to see how they can circumvent sign on and sign up protection. There's those that use AI to their advantage, which that means that my team also needs to be using AI to our advantage, right?
Yeah, so a bit of an arms race, and exactly. I suppose it's detecting very minute signals. Then if people are building these, like a forward farm, where they're very, very motivated to try and make something seem very, very realistic, but underlying that must be some sort of an algorithm for delays between taps, things like that, and your team's got to work the magic of trying to understand that.
Exactly. And so it's a very, very extremely thin line between this a human behavior or is this a scripted bot behavior? And in some cases, it could be the actual fraudster who is a human who's trying to attempt a type of sign into our environment. So those behaviors are going to be human in nature because it is a human behind the scenes. So how do we look at other attributes that tell us that this is some anomalous activity, that this doesn't align with the type of legitimate accounts that we want to sign up for our services and that we want to allow access to other customer services? How do we monitor those types of things to ensure that when we deploy algorithms that we don't have a lot of false positives, that we're not identifying somebody as a fraudster who really isn't, and then vice versa? How do we catch the real fraudsters?
So whether or not it's human behavior or AI,
exactly.
It's almost solving a problem that's quite hard, that these applications that students are often falling foul of, where they're AI detectors and things like that, where if you write in a particular way, it gets picked up as something, and you're trying to make sure that the false positives of somebody who maybe they're just dodgy by nature, The first thing they do is, when they sign up for a tenant is, right, okay, let's see how many emails I can send in one day. Right, okay, I've done 1,000 per minute. We're good to go for our legitimate business. But trying to make sure that apart from those weird anomalies, that you're not picking out the next big customer who's signing up for Microsoft services that goes elsewhere because they fell foul of it and can't use it.
Exactly. So this is what makes my job challenging, but also makes it a lot of fun, is how do you adapt? How do you find the signal in between all of the noise? How do you do it in a way that's precise and that provides value to Microsoft and to our customers? And we have to think about things such as, our customer environments may have seasonal upticks in activity. So how do you distinguish that between, like you said, maybe a fraudster who's sending 1,000 emails all at once? Are these legitimate or are they not?
And I think some of the stats that were shared in the past when Alex Weinert came on the show, billions, something like 1.3 billion enterprise authentications a day, and a massive amount of unusual activity being blocked. So this is not blocking or trying to find the signal in the noise in a small amount of data either. This is a world class operation then in terms of the amount of data. I suppose there's not many people doing it at a bigger scale.
Probably not. We're at the scale of blocking millions of sign-up attempts a day, scale of identifying millions of what we believe to be fraudulent transactions a day, and making sure that, as much as possible, no one's harmed by those transactions. And what we need for my team in particular is machine learning and AI. There's no way at this scale that we can be ahead of the attackers or even keep up with the attackers without something like that. So part of my team is product managers who come up with ideas and features of what we need to protect Microsoft and our customers. And then part of our partner teams are engineers and data scientists to figure out all of these heuristics and algorithms that we need to put in place to make this happen.
It seems such a daunting job. I'm just casting my mind back to when I was a system administrator, and this is going back 15 years or so. And it was an impossible task across, just 200 servers or so to look at the potential for unauthenticated.
That's such a hard word to say.
I've said it enough times in the past. Unauthenticated attempts, erroneous attempts, especially to servers that were exposed to the internet in some way. And just that sort of stuff alone, impossible to really keep up with, even with tools at the time, Splunk and things like that, to try and detect and pull out patterns from that. And that was purely, for the best part, HTTP, VPN, SSH type logon attempts. And that's going back 15 years. A reasonable sized team in an enterprise customer would have struggled with that. I think about your task. Even with the data scientists helping you with this, it requires some ability to really sort of scale up then and attack these problems on a wide berth, knowing that the impact of getting it wrong is probably quite daunting too.
You're exactly right. The impact of getting it wrong. When we think about the billions of sign-up attempts, and if we say our algorithms have 99% precision, that leaves that 1%. And 1% of a billion is still a very large number, right? So that's some of the constraints that my team is working around, is how do we get a precision level that supports our business, that protects our business, but also allows, like you said, for my team to scale up in certain ways. We're not necessarily scaling up in the human factor in bodies, but we're using technology to our benefit.
Yeah. And that does seem to be a common way of gaining value from using technology these days, without mentioning AI too much. But obviously that's the promise, isn't it? That it gives an individual team of smart folk the ability to do a lot more, because there's only so many smart folk, I guess, you can employ against these sort of tasks.
Well, I mean, you can continuously deploy people to the problem, but even so, attackers are using AI and technology to their benefit. Throwing more bodies at the problem is not necessarily going to help to solve it, right?
And insider threat programs is an area that you've been involved with. Is that right?
Oh, insider threats. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I notice when some customers activate insider threats in Microsoft 365, then it can be quite daunting to sort out the good from the bad in a way, even with that technology available. What have you learned that's worth sharing about how people do deal with insider threats in a reasonably effective way, or how to get started with knowing what to look for?
Yeah. I would say the most important thing here is the baseline of your starting point. Do you know what is a typical behavior of a certain job function, of a certain employee, of a certain regional aspect of your organization? How do you come up with those behavioral analytics or identify those behavioral analytics that tell you that something's amiss here? It also requires some level of human to human interaction, some level of empathy. As a manager, understanding when I see particular changes within my team members, that may be a trigger to say maybe there's some other activity that's happening that we need to investigate. Never want it to be actually about the person. You want it to be about behaviors.
Yeah. And a common thing across many people who end up solving a problem is you don't think about the problem till you've had it. So we're turning on insider threats, even though we've had the E5 license for several years, because this has happened. So based on what you said, you needing a baseline or being at least very helpful in having one means at least switching this on first. So it's gathering the data, so you know what good looks like, rather than, well, it's happening, we don't know what's going on, and it's just you're trying to deal with the bad data and the normal behavior all at once.
Yeah, to your point, turning it on and then monitoring what's happening, so you start to establish that baseline. Having folks who can take a look at that data and confirm, hey, this is typical behavior for Joe and for Jane. This is typical behavior for my SOC analyst to be doing these things day in and day out. That way, once you have that pattern established, if there's deviations from there, understanding how far that deviation goes, and what thresholds you want to establish to say, at this point, now there's a time that we should be investigating. This is off by a certain percentage of behavior. This is anomalous. There's a risk here.
Yeah. And that empathy side as well is, I suppose, apparent where people are doing something that looks strange, but you might want to. That's got to be a very difficult thing, because in IT, we don't usually reach out to a user and say, well, what are you doing? There might be some procedures that you need to follow. I can think of a scenario like last week, my PC at work managed by autopilot, so I was rebuilding it at the time in a coffee shop because something had went wrong. So what I had to do was go in, and we've got things are well set up reasonably. So we've got Defender for Cloud set up, which meant I couldn't download the presentation I needed. So I had to split it up into several parts because it's bigger than 35 megabyte, and then repeatedly send the bits over to my personal email address, knowing it's a customer presentation. It's fine, really, to do. It's something that doesn't contain anything privileged. But as I was doing it, I thought, this does look dodgy. And obviously, HR being informed of some strange behaviour, I'd have obviously had a good explanation for it, but I'd have felt a little bit aggrieved, even though I kind of knew, well, this you might well have to explain this later on. So scenarios like that, for example, assuming that it was within policy.
And I know every organization is going to have their own types of policies, but in that particular scenario, I were your manager, Steve, and hey, the SOC analysts are saying, hey, Steve's doing something. Me as a manager to say, Steve, hey, is something going on? Is there some additional help? I see some odd reports about you working from a new location. Is everything okay? Establishing those relationships with the people that you work with closest, compared to something maybe going to an HR, because then that puts somebody on alert that, hey, they're watching me, and you start to have this creepy vibe about it, versus, hey, we're trying to protect company resources and we want to make sure that you're okay, Steve.
Yeah. And again, in that situation, just for any colleagues of mine that are listening, that that you're rebuilding a laptop, you've got to go to a meeting. It's one of those situations where it happens, doesn't it? Something goes wrong with the equipment you've got, and then you've got to work around it, and you've got to balance some risk. And you go, well, there's nothing that we're not going to email over to the customer here or share with them, but I've got to go through these steps right now, and it just looks bad. And that's the kind of thing you'd expect. Emailing multiple files all at one go to an external email address, especially my personal one, you'd think that should trigger some of those things, and then empathy for that situation that don't lock their account out immediately. Because the flip side of that would be that if I was a salesperson, and this is something a salesperson might have to do, then that action of not considering what actually is it an insider threat first might have lost the company a big sale because a laptop broke. And again, that's not the user's fault in many cases.
Yeah, so there's definitely a balance that has to be had there, because those behaviors could also be seen as, hey, Steve may be getting ready to make his exit, and maybe he's taking some personal company property with him. So again, to me, that's a good situation where the manager or somebody who's closest to you reaches out and says, hey, what's going on here? Your laptop not working the way that we need, and let's get this fixed, right? And trying to dig into what the root of the issue is. And then from there, they can kind of ascertain of, hey, Steve's acting a little sketchy. Maybe we do need to monitor some of the things that are being sent out.
So it's not just about the data. It's about empathy. It's about understanding how people work in the organization and the type of things that can happen, and treating those kind of situations quite sensitively, because the most valuable asset an organization has is its employees. The last thing IT want to do is disenfranchise them after putting in loads of good tools, because some of those things, like my laptop's playing up, it won't boot, being able to reinstall it from anywhere is actually brilliant by IT, Microsoft, for having the technologies to do that. But then you got those situations where you're in between. That's those kind of problems and solutions aren't just then about data and policies that automatically lock somebody out there. So that's another sort of balancing the human factor and alongside what the data says, a key part then of managing insider threats.
Yeah, I'd say the human element is one of the biggest elements of cybersecurity. It's also the trust but verify, which is, again, where that manager would come in and hey, what's going on? Things seem a little off here. So.
Yeah, I wonder whether we'll be a co-pilot for that. Instead of it looks like you're writing a letter. Oh, I'm thinking of Clippy. It looks like you're an insider threat. Are you? No. I'm not. That would be great. I mean, we do have those kind of products with DLP and things like that, where this looks like you're sending out everybody's personal details. Are you sure you want to do that? Yes. Justify it, because I'm leaving the company soon, and I would like to take the company client list with me. Okay.
And this is an opportunity for technology to work alongside the human piece of this. So.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to move on. So you are one of the keynote speakers at Tech 2024 in Dallas this October. And do you want to tell us a little bit about what you're going to be talking about?
Yes. So my talk is going to be about identity, and I'm calling it Everything Everywhere All at Once. You've seen that movie. You understand that there's this woman who undergoes this experience where she's thrust into these alternate versions of herself. She gains additional strengths and dimensions of who she is based on that. I'm saying that there's a parallel to what's happened with digital identity over time. When I first started my career, identity was more of like a name and a badge, and that's what identity basically constituted. Over time, as organizations have moved to the cloud, we've become more digitized, identity has started to mean different things. And then in the future, now that we have AI, what is the context of identity in those cases? And so we'll be exploring the journey of identity over time.
So is it an essential pre-watch to watch the movie first to get all the references?
It'd be helpful, but also, keep people in on and bring you along on the journey.
So that said, that's going to be this October 1st to 2nd.
Yes.
And of course, people can still sign up for Tech if they're listening now. Now, I'm going to move on to shadow identities, which sounds scary to me.
Everything in cyber is scary.
Well, yes, it certainly does. So what are shadow identities for? Because I thought it was two different things when we were chatting before. So even though I said most of our listeners may well completely know what this is, for those that don't, like myself, as we were talking before, do you want to tell us a little bit more about what is a shadow identity compared to other types of additional identities that people have?
Yeah, and people may have called this by other names, but essentially shadow identity is this concept of an identity may have a presence in different environments, yet there's a lack of visibility as an admin or as an organization to this end-to-end access that an employee may have within the company. So for example, I may have access in an Entra environment. I may have access in a GCP environment. I may also have access in a software as a solution environment, Salesforce, for example. And there may be this string of activities that I could do across these three environments that together pose a risk. Individually, maybe they don't. And so where do you have visibility to this access? Who's monitoring this? How do you make sure that should these identities be compromised, you're cutting off the entire kill chain of what somebody can do?
Right. So this could be the lack of visibility into, let's say, a customer at one time gave me an account on their Facebook Workplace. I was writing something for doing an export from it, not to look at the social media stuff, not interested in that, but to do an export from it. And I was given normal rights, but then given additional rights to be able to use the API and export lots of information, right? So their IT team, because this was given by the comms team who managed the Facebook Workplace, their IT team wouldn't have had visibility then over what I could do because my normal account with a customer was completely unprivileged contractor type account. That's an example of a shadow identity then, I suppose, that also potentially could delete a set of corporate data given the task. And the people that manage that may not have a particular motivation to go back and remove that access.
Yes. How do you track it back to the source? And even thinking about things like APIs, many organizations that I've been in, there may not have been, quote unquote, an owner of those APIs and the service accounts that are calling those transactions. What can those APIs do behind the scenes? Those APIs exposed in such a way that if I leave the company, I still can trigger, certain activities. Those APIs still in use over time, and is there, data leakage that's potentially happening as a result of old APIs that may not be valuable or viable anymore? So there's this whole, chain of different events and identities where you can map this back to shadow access, shadow identities.
And this could be, I think, then, like when the company I work for, part of the company does cyber essentials assessments, and when I've been tasked with helping come up with tasks to remediate some of this, some of the things that might be there are on a Linux server somewhere that runs an application. There's a text file, a config file that includes a token, and it's in plain text in there. And that's not massively uncommon, I suppose. But in one case, it could be a Hugging Face token for downloading information off of GitHub. But in some cases, it could be actually a token that could be used to destroy all your data because it's been put in, left there, and it's got the ability to read and write and remove access from a particular cloud environment, I suppose.
Yeah.
And those are not easy to fix either, right? If that's the way the application is set up, or the developers of the purchased application have said to us in the past, it needs these permissions in SharePoint. It has to be able to read, write, and delete all SharePoint libraries. And the customer said, hold on a minute. Hold on. And we've had to get the developers on the line. That's the only way it can be done.
Yeah, and I would definitely challenge those scenarios. But a lot of this, to me, gets back to some security fundamentals, which say fundamental, but sometimes those things are hard because it's the base of what we need to do doesn't mean it's easy. And one of the things here is making sure that there's an owner for an identity. It's different than saying me as Shinesa is an identity. When I talk about an owner for an identity, that goes back to the APIs, that goes back to a particular logon, that goes back to what you mentioned could be these keys or these tokens in a file. Who ultimately owns that, and what's the governance process around those? Governance process around how do those things connect, but also the governance process around the access that they have and the access they have over time. The right access, is it overprivileged? Is that what's still needed? So again, the governance piece of this and the ownership piece of these identities is really important.
And it sounds like this almost comes back to the goal organizations or IT departments have had for a long time, which is one of those projects that comes around, I guess, every so often. Let's get an SSO platform, or let's get everything working against Entra ID, would be the more common one these days, so that you've got some visibility. Is that the right place to start, or is the tooling that can be used to go off and find where these other identities are?
Yeah. There's going to be, I think, a host of things, unfortunately. So it's not going to be a size fits all. It's going to be dependent upon where is the sprawl that exists within your environment. Ultimate thing is making sure that you have context about these different identities. And a starting point is a repository. Is there a common place where identities of all types are being stored that's known? Is it spread out over various places? Mention about SSO. Sticky notes, yeah. If all your identities are on the sticky notes and it's in a locked drawer, maybe that's okay.
When I was an IT admin, I remember we once went down to a department and the office manager decided she was IT support and she had a book with everybody's password in, which seemed like a great idea to her. But not necessarily to us. It's not necessarily, it's knowledge of the owner of them, not the password itself, obviously. But it just reminded me of years of those sort of things. The Post-it notes being the example everybody's seen, but a book of passwords. Yeah. You can buy them though, can't you? Internet passwords in the shop.
Yeah.
Don't buy one of them would be your advice though. Or if you do, don't put the passwords in it.
Well, and to your point, I can remember at the start of my career that stuff like this was common, right? And overprivilege was common. And we had regulation that came in that said, hey, you need to trace these identities and this access back because this can impact your financials. And you need to be able to search that these numbers are accurate. Over time, there's been, certain scenarios that have forced us to be more diligent about how we protect identity, what we do with identity. And that kind of gets back to what I'll be talking about at the keynote as well.
Yeah. So if you were to give any advice for people listening today, given that we're Practical 365, we're always about being practical, what should people take away and do as perhaps one reasonably safe to do task that could set them on a journey to improving their security?
Yeah. So the one thing, and it's probably kind of beating this idea into the ground, but please do go through the learning tracks that Microsoft has available when it comes to AI and Copilot. There are sometimes these theories that are out here in the security market that, hey, AI thing may not be real, that AI is coming to take your job, all this, I'm going to call it nonsense type of thing.
A bit like the cloud, where if you Practical 365 years ago was called something else when it was on-prem. People moved to the cloud. They had to learn about that. AI, I suppose it could take your job if you don't learn about it, or rather somebody else might take your job doing the new thing.
That's exactly, and you know what, you're giving my keynote for me, Steve, because I talk about the fact that there's this middle period of time when people were on-prem and this whole cloud concept came to be. A lot of companies and individuals were scared about what is this cloud and nobody's ever going to use it and this doesn't make sense. And here we are, I would say probably a good majority of the world are using cloud services or migrated to the cloud. It's going to be the same with AI. And don't think of it as this thing that's going to take your job, but we call Copilot for a reason. This is your partner in making sure that you can do those things that make you an exceptional employee.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that the cloud has certainly done, and I imagine AI may do as well, is take away some of those bottom rungs for getting on. But I think Copilot, for example, an example I had from a customer was even a senior manager starting, found Copilot useful for learning about the new business that they're in. So I know there's two sides to it, but if you were starting out now, one thing I always worry about is how would I have got to where I am today? Because when I started pre-cloud, then, you could have a job where you started doing physical things like racking servers and so on. There's somewhat of a learning curve, really, isn't there, for learning about all of this stuff. So what advice would you give to young people from all sorts of backgrounds, women, men, who are trying to get into cybersecurity today?
Mm-hmm. The main thing is be curious. Go out, play around. Microsoft makes available tenants in some cases where you can go out and set up your own environment. You can explore what these technologies do. You can set this up. You can share this knowledge with your friends. You can get hands-on experience. There's not a limit to you understanding what's available and making yourself marketable in this field.
So free hands-on experience because you can get free Azure credits, free. And if you're a student, then there's often at universities programs for that as well. Microsoft 365 developer tenant is one thing that comes to mind that gives you these E5 licenses. So get hands-on, actually get practical. Loads of guides on our site, obviously, and elsewhere. But just start doing the do, because I guess that reflects how I got some of my first jobs, which was the practical experience.
Yeah, and I feel like Microsoft has made it very, very easy for you to get that hands-on experience if you want it. It's available. Yeah. There's so many free resources available to people.
And I said, well, back in the day, whenever that day was, you get a job and then you're hands-on. But actually, when what you just said reminds me of that then it was almost impossible to get any sort of experience with enterprise kit. So with real servers or with a real SAN, the things that you needed to learn about to plug things together. And people still do buy Cisco old kit off the internet to learn about those kind of weird fundamentals. But your point is the vast majority of stuff that businesses are using is in the cloud and it's there. And you've got all the Microsoft Learning stuff to help learn about that if that's the direction you want to go.
Exactly. Look out 2, 3, 5 years ahead of where organizations are going, where the industry is going. I can guarantee you that there's resources that Microsoft has made available for you to learn about that and prepare yourself for that journey.
So that's some great takeaways. I do thank you for being on the show today. And I guess everybody listening who's going to tech is going to be absolutely looking forward to your keynote as well. So don't miss that. And of course, if you're on the edge of your seat, just about to sign up for tech, make sure you do it as soon as possible. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today, Shinesa.
And thank you so much, Steve. It was a pleasure.
Thanks.